Hi, everyone. Welcome to the IDA documentary screening series. My name is Ruzel Castillo. I am the Public Programs and Events Manager with the IDA. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to have a great conversation with the filmmakers of Socks on Fire, moderated by Kitty Green. And before we get started, I'd like to offer land acknowledgement coming to you from Los Angeles, on the unceded lands of the Chumash and Tongva people who have been stewards of this land for generations. I also like to thank our media sponsor, IndieWire, for helping us bring this series to you. Check out our remaining films at www.documentary.org/screening-series. Now let's welcome Kitty to discuss Socks on Fire. Hi, Kitty.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm here with Bo McGuire, the director of Socks on Fire, and the editor, Max Allman. Welcome, guys.
So good to be here. So good to see you, Kitty.
You too. Congrats on the film. I love the film, so I'm very excited to chat to you today. How are you feeling? Are you feeling? How's the reception been? How's it been out there?
Yeah, a healthy yo-yo of like exhausted and exhilarating, because we've been doing this tour, traveling around with the film, and also doing drag performances. So like that part can be very wary. It can get me road tired, but always like the people love it, the audiences love it, and to finally get this film specifically to like Southern and rural queer people and like hear them react in the audience and hear them after the film, like say, I've never seen myself represented on film before, but now I have a film that does that. It's been incredible. It is enough nourishment for the soul to maybe want to do something like this again.
Cool, amazing. Let's begin at the beginning. So where did this whole project come from? Like what started you on this journey essentially?
Yeah, I think necessity. Like I was in grad school at NYU in the film program, and I really wanted to make a narrative feature, and I had a script, but I didn't have the funds for it. And simultaneous to like figuring that out, in NYU telling me, Bo, if you don't like make a feature or you don't make your thesis, we're going to graduate you without using the equipment. Simultaneous to that, like this sort of drama was going down in my family, and suddenly the family I'd always known was like bursting apart, and my Uncle John's home was in jeopardy. And so I thought, nobody can be more Uncle John than Uncle John. And so we might as well just take this equipment that I have for a week and have some really talented folks and really good people who aren't afraid to go out in the field and get dirty and murky, and just see what can happen. And so really I had a list of 10 sort of visuals that I wanted to get. They were sort of music video references, I guess, at best. I had just watched Beyonce's Lemonade quite a few times. And so I just knew we needed to come down. And we always, I think from the shooting down, even into the editing, nothing was ever off the table. So we knew that we wanted to, yes, like go for the glory and get some cinematic beauty and like discover what our visual language was, but also that we could shoot anything. That like our conversation about getting ready in the morning, what we were going to shoot, was just as much as a part of the making as was just as much a part of the movie as the the interviews were or the reenactments were. That the making kept interrupting whatever narrative we were trying to force onto my family and the landscape.
And your background, were you always interested in filmmaking? Like, what's your story? How did you end up here?
Yeah, I don't know that I've always been interested in filmmaking, but I've always been interested in the way that films can unlock emotion and unlock parts of ourselves that we have been hiding from ourselves, or that we need to be reimagined within ourselves. So like that part of me always feels very filmmakery. And there was a part of me as a little boy that would like round up everyone in the neighborhood to put on these skits that I would write. It's always like that part of it, and the sort of like directing and imagining other characters and other lives and other scenes. But like my background is in poetry. So I came from really a writerly background. And that's really because, where I come from in Alabama, there isn't really a model for how to be a director or what that looks like in the world. People sort of, you say you're an artist and people are like, how are you going to make that a career? How are you going to make money off of that? So I went to school to be a teacher and then found my way into writing. And then, was obsessed with Lady Gaga and Beyonce's Telephone with my mentor at the poetry program at the University of Arizona. And she said, what do you want to be doing instead of writing poetry? And I said, I want to be making these videos. I want to be doing this. I want to be putting motion into emotion, emotion into motion. So she said, apply to film school and see what happens. So that's what I did.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, because everything, I don't know, the film has such as an organic, it feels really like an organic structure. Like it's really lyrical. It's really kind of beautifully woven together. So I guess I have some nerdy techie questions about how much like thought about the framework did you have going in? Did you have a script? Like what did it look like when you were kind of putting it all together? And I guess Max can feel free to chime in too about the process of editing it and kind of all these elements. Like how do you weave all of that in essentially? So beautiful.
Yeah, the nerdy techie questions are for Max, but I will say I had always had very little idea. Like I didn't have much planned out ever. And that sort of like, that's where I discovered like the narrative for me. And the making of the movie really was in concert with like my imagination and my crew and that collaboration, where we kind of left ourselves open. Like the whole me getting tied to that pole was never supposed to be part of the movie, but in like the making and in going to Heflin and talking with my Uncle Roy, that story sort of like emerged and became this myth amongst the crew. We were like, well, damn, we need to shoot this thing. So in that way, I never felt like I was planning ahead, probably in a very lazy way or in a very like rushed way. And then, we had a whole bunch of footage from our first round of production. And that's where Max comes in, where he just came down to Alabama and lived with me for a long, long time. I always say 3 weeks, but I guess it is more like 3 months anyway. And we sort of just like started trying to put the puzzle pieces together. I don't know how Max did that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was like a really liberating editorial experience because I think the order of operations was incredibly organic. I think, again, a lot of times in a documentary edit, I mean, it's always kind of discovery based, but I think the way that we were shooting, which was kind of in part motivated by the moments in the footage that were kind of speaking to us, it really allowed us to kind of find the best moments in these myths to kind of support the structure of the film. We did the interviews really late, which was kind of I don't know, to me, sometimes the edits can be built from a radio edit and then you're just kind of trying to reverse engineer the visual language based on these moments. And for us, it was totally like, get out and land, get out in kind of Bo's sort of mythical space and how he sees his family, and allow those moments to build out our world visually, emotionally, all those things. And then we'll kind of capture what we need to build the context and to kind of give you the corners or the holes to peek through and see these things and understand them better, but to really allow, I think, Bo's unique voice and his visual sort of approach to kind of dictate the experience. And so that was really it for us. I mean, it was discovery. It was also, I think, challenging ourselves to like, put empathy into places that we maybe didn't expect to, or to carve or, dig deeper on things that at first felt maybe we could keep them on the surface, but knowing we needed to go deeper, I think, to have a better understanding of the family dynamics. So yeah, I mean, it was, to me, one of probably the most creatively liberating edit experiences I've ever had, because it was like a flow, I mean, the way that we did it was we would cut together some sequences. Bo would kind of write a first draft on his voiceover. We'd kind of cut those together, go back, rehash it, make it better, and then find the spots in the archive that support. I mean, it was never too, calculated. I think it was always about responding to the footage that we were kind of capturing at times in a very free form way and allowing us to build the narrative out of that. And I think Bo's sort of visual language and his written language is so defined that so much of what we were bringing back was always already kind of feeling in the language that we were trying to build. So yeah, it was, very fun.
And we were out to break new ground. Like really nothing was off the table. We wanted new narrative ground. We wanted to sort of come from this tradition of great Southern writers and like think about what other sort of ways to tell a Southern story. Like I always say, like the way I always described it to Max was like, it should be how Nanny would tell a story, which is in a million directions and all at once, and assuming you knew every character. And like, even though you may not understand what she was talking about point to point, you didn't care because you were relying on her voice. And I think like, that's also where I think like sort of the nuts and bolts. I was thinking about how we wrote this or what I would say about writing this, Max. And I was thinking like, I don't think about discovery so much as I think about like our friendship. And I think about talking to you late at night on the couch, watching Drag Race. Like that's really when it feels, it was just organic in that way. And I think that like we really tried to impress and press each other forward. And that we're interested in a story that would revolve like a revolution and not resolve. And so we would make these sort of like movements, lyrical movements, and then see how they needed to be stitched together afterwards. So there's a lot of movements that are on, you know, the floor, but the move, you know, we were looking after for that final movement, which is the whole piece, I think.
And at what point did the reenactments come? Because there are reenactments with actors. At what point did you bring them in? Was that like midway through, or was that something that was you felt like you needed once you were kind of getting the shape of it? Like when did that element kind of present itself?
Yeah, well, I'm obsessed with reenactments and like the power they hold and how they're often used not well, or in my opinion. I just feel like, you know, there's always so much fun to be had that's ever had in documentary with reenactment, or rarely have. And I wanted to do that from the beginning. And I knew that I was working up against the fact that Aunt Sharon would never be a part of this movie, and how to represent her and how to find sort of queer rebelliousness in that decision. And that's when I turned to our associate producer, Billy Ray, and I said, are there any drag queens in Birmingham that you think are good actors? And he said, well, my friend Chuck Duck is a good actor and he comes alive in drag. And I said, well, his name is Chuck Duck, so let's just cast him as Aunt Sharon. And like goes on to like, in my opinion, give one of the greatest camp performances of the 21st century as Aunt Sharon. And so that was pretty immediate, but like I knew I wanted to play, but I also didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with the reenactments. And the whole sort of like trade line thing, that the radio show was all improvised between me and Chuck as a first like run through about how to reenact Aunt Sharon and how she would react and what she would be like in that conversation. And then I wanted to carry that sort of gender fuckery on into, you know, like the person who plays me is a little girl that my mother cleans her family's house. And I just sort of like wanted a space and a palette in the form of an actor to play out my sort of queer imagination of how these people exist in my mind. And I wanted some distance between who the people really are and how they're represented in this film, which are two different things.
Yeah, and I think in a really interesting like nuts and bolts way, so many, and I actually call them reinterpretations. That's like my word to use, because it's like, you know, we were so not always interested in like what is the exact thing that happened, but what's like the emotional reverberation that creates within the myth of this family, you know, and how the game of telephone over the years changes the feeling of what a story means and what it means to insert Bo into his grandmother's emotional space and to see her decisions from a different angle. But from an edit perspective, what is amazing is that so many of them were the first thing ever shot. Like there was very little, you know, kind of traditional doc footage, I think, in the first really big leg of what shot this film. And I think that's what really shaped so much of our sort of editorial, you know, that movement creation it wasn't really driven by just pure narrative. It was almost driven by sort of creating myth, you know, and sort of figuring out a way to create that lore in this space. How we look at Alabama, you know, how we do all of that was kind of done almost in this, you know, non-fiction space. And then we kind of colored in some other things later on with interviews. Some of those interviews generated new reinterpretations. You know, it was kind of a constant callback process that was never, you know, one, then this to make sense of this. It was kind of all coming to a conclusion, you know, from different directions. But yeah, I mean, watching the reinterpretation scenes really, really early on was like, when I got on the phone with Bo for the first time, I was like, I won't take a job forever. I'm coming to Alabama, sure, as long as I can. So, you know.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, talking about like creating, we're trying to, I don't know, create myth and talking about history and talking about memory. What were kind of your influences, I guess? You mentioned Beyonce's Lemonade, but what were you pointing to when you were trying to explain maybe to others what this film would look like, or what were things that influenced you and inspired you when you were in the edit, I guess, or in the production?
Yeah, I think it's a question that trips me up a lot, is this very question, because I think I don't, especially, you know, like in documentary and even in film terms, it's like people want that sort of comparison, and like all of my comparisons exist in another space, you know, like they will be, like Max will tell you, we watched Patti LaBelle sing Somewhere Over the Rainbow many times, a live performance, and I would be like, this is the emotion, like I want to feel this way when I'm watching this scene. So I don't have a great answer. I know that we always said that, you know, we thought of Socks on Fire as like a queer disruption into Ross McElwee Sherman's March. And that's like our sort of granddaddy, where like you think you're watching a film about one thing, but then because of the filmmaker and the implication of the filmmaker being there, it turns into something else. Max probably has a better list than I do.
But I would always try to show Bo, I was like, look, watch this scene from The Arbor. And then he'd be like, watch this scene when I'm from The Coal Miner's Daughter, because that's really what I'm, you know, it was always kind of, or watch a Patti LaBelle scene, let's watch Drag Race every night during the edit. I mean, it was kind of a three-dimensional form of lots of different textures coming in and out. And I think, you know, what really helped Bo and I early on was just sort of also that the northern light of you know, just the tradition of Southern storytelling, the way that Faulkner can create sort of a mythical family that has a lore and has a story, and it feels so real, but it also feels so real, you know. And I think Flannery and Truman, all of those sort of the tradition of, you know, Southern writers who see the South in its sort of scars and its, you know, imperfections, but also in its very rarefied beauty and darkness and brightness and all of that, trying to kind of think about language that way and landscape that way and how it relates to the people there. A lot of those people were kind of, I think, some of our early uniting ways. But also, yeah, I mean, you know, I had never watched Drag Race before I met Bo, and then just that was kind of our decompressing thing every night. Just, you know, let's watch 2 or 3 episodes, and that was kind of like, for me, one of the more inspirational textures I was taking.
Yeah.
Cool.
And just hanging out with Mama, like getting, like, I think Max, like it's like the beauty of the narrative of how it got formed was like Max being deeply embedded into my family and like seeing all of their wonderfulness and all their edges and being able to like figure out how to make a story, how to put that into the story. And I do have the great Kitty Green's casting JonBenet was a huge influence on me. I'm not supposed to say this right now, but I will. Like, I would say that because it was the first time like I ever thought about like, this is a film that's like, what are we actually documenting? And that's what I was after. Like, it wasn't about the sort of family squabble for me. I was working my way through that, but I really wanted to be like, this is a documentary about a sort of a place and a feeling of being queer in a place that is sort of supposed to be closed off to queerness. And what does that documentary look like? And how do you show that? Like, how do you document that?
Yeah, I read something you was talking about how you wanted to lean into the friction in the South around those issues. Can we talk a little bit more about the friction and the rub? What is that? I mean, yeah, was it, I guess, I mean, okay, let's go to the other end. Does it feel like a cathartic process, like coming out the other end of it, I guess? And having explored all that and having really dived in and leaned into all that, how do you feel now?
Yeah, and I feel like that, and I feel like the work has been good. Like I said, about like meeting rural queer people and being like, I know this story. This is like this is a version of my story. So that feels really good. And it also feels not only cathartic, but like powerful in a way. Like it feels like I did Nanny proud in a way. Like I feel like, and I sort of did it for myself, and that feels good. And not necessarily any other outside pressures. And I feel like, you know, I feel like I held up the good things about where I come from and also acknowledged the pain about where I come from and what it feels like to be a queer person here, and to love a place that doesn't often love you back, at least, going down the laws and the state line of things. But I also feel like I made a movie that bucks up against that and shows the women, that brought me up, who showed me that it wasn't all just one thing, that all good history is local. Like, that's what Miss Young taught me. It's like, get out and actually talk to your neighbors and know their stories. And so I think, I was sort of out to, I feel like the South gets scapegoated a lot for this country's problems, larger problems. And so I feel a certain pride and feeling like, and I feel like there's still work to do, work I'll always be doing, but I feel a certain amount of pride of being able to look that monster in the face, play with it, turn it into something new, set it on fire to create sparks. And the feeling of that only wants me to like lean in even more, and find out what else there is to say about the goodness and the badness. And Max will have something genius to say, I'm sure. The friction.
I mean, I'm also, any Southerner who has a complicated relationship to the place that they come from, where, the resentment and frustration is always sort of right next to that love and understanding that you wouldn't be who you are if you weren't raised in that environment. And I think, what Bo does incredibly well is to make something singular from within. And, a lot of doc work, a lot of art house films, it can kind of have an outsider approach to, I think, that more like anthropological sort of documentation. And Bo's is, it never feels that way. And I think one thing that we've always felt is really important is to also just get this movie into places that, that's movie deserts, places that have sort of just learned that they don't deserve to have these films played in, very bespoke ways that kind of speak to them, uniquely. And I think that's what we've been doing in the last 6 months, is kind of getting this movie out in meaningful ways to these places so that people can kind of see that mirror held up. And, the way that it plays in the South is like, I think it is that cathartic feeling that when we first started editing this was what we were always chasing. So.
Yeah, are there any differences between playing it in the South and playing it elsewhere? Have you noticed audiences react in a different way, or?
Well, I only see that they love it. That's all I see. But no, I think that there is a feeling amongst Southern audiences that they understand maybe when to laugh and when to be sad in a way that maybe audiences from without don't necessarily. They're scared to laugh often at Chuck Duck, whereas I feel like a Southern audience knows that aunt, knows that that's a man in drag, and knows that they've seen Still Magnolias and they know this is a whole play on Still Magnolias. So I think that that's the difference. And I just think that there's a little more, well, I mean, I say this, it's all individual, it's all community. Because I'm thinking back now to some Southern screenings that didn't feel so loving, but by and large, there's a lot of love in the room when it comes to a Southern audience. I just think
and I think that the truth is no place is a monolith. And, also playing it in the North, it's like once John gets up on stage and starts doing his, drag performance at the end of the movie, at the Tribeca screening, I mean, everybody was in their seats and throwing their glow sticks. And it kind of, at the end of the day, I think anytime when you watch the movie just together, the feeling, I think, can get pretty infectious towards the end, no matter where you are. So.
Yeah. And I think that audiences from without the South say, oh, that's the South. And the Southerners watch it and they're like, oh, that's us. There's still stuff to learn on both sides, as far as what is actually happening in the South and what Southern storytelling means.
Yeah. I was at that Tribeca screening and I met your parents, who was so excited to be there, and it was such a lovely kind of family affair. And how has it been? How have the family kind of embraced, or have they embraced it? And how do they feel about, such large numbers of people seeing kind of their stories, private, personal.
Yeah. Mom is overseeing herself. She's tired of watching herself in the movie, but yet she's still there whenever she can be. So, I mean, that's her story she's telling, and what she's always said from the very beginning of all of this is, I don't understand who would want to watch this movie. This is just our family being our family. So she sort of comes with that like loveliness about like the smallness of it. Where on the other side, you have Uncle John, who's been waiting for this moment his whole life and like loves the camera and, has, just is really here to meet the bigness of the moment. So it's been nice to have that balance amongst them. And I think my dad is super proud. And I think that there are other members of the family who are not as proud or as happy, but, they would have to get a camera themselves and start making their movie.
Yeah. How did you convince them all to get on board? Like, what was the first discussions around what this would be to them, essentially?
Yeah, I left them in the dark most of the time. Like, they knew that I was sort of making a movie about the family and about Nanny, and that I wanted to get Uncle John back in drag because he hadn't been back in drag in a very long time. And I figured, what the hell? We've got a camera, you've got the gear, like, let's just do it. And so I don't know that there was ever like a sit down moment with us. It was just sort of like, this is what we're doing, and it's sort of, we come at it with a sense of play. And that's Nanny's house, that's the forest, like that is where I learned to play and to imagine. And so I think that like I sort of just threw them into it and didn't really ask their permission. But I also know them, and I know how to ask them. And I know, if I told Mom we're coming with a camera, she would probably disappear from her house. But if I said we're just coming over to eat and we may have the camera with us, that's a whole other different story to her. She's getting to feed people, and then we get to see Mama, cooking, which is its own art. But with Uncle, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was saying, the hardest part of getting your mom to do the interview on camera was that it was the same night as the SEC championship game, and Alabama was playing. So we were like right in this like emotional spot. She's kind of crying in the interview, and it was kind of like she was crying, but also checking the score in the back room at the same time. So we had to end up cutting it a little short after that. But that's my favorite part.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just had a question and then it disappeared from my mind. Sorry. I was going to say something about the family. I guess so. Here it is. You're making something with people you know so well. Were there any surprises along the way? Like, did the filmmaking trigger kind of new stories or new perspectives on things you felt you knew, or
Yeah, there was for sure a conversation I had sitting in the kitchen floor with Uncle John one late night after we had shot with him, or maybe even after a day we weren't shooting with him, where he just stopped by. And like my mother has a whole other story about her life before I came onto the scene, before my father came onto the scene. And so I sort of like, I learned, I hope my mother never watches this, she never will. But like I learned, I just got to fill in some of those gaps. And that was sort of like also a moment where Uncle John got to hand me down information, family lore, family myth that I didn't have. So that was a really beautiful moment. And I'll say time and time again, Uncle John and I are more like brothers than we are like uncle and nephew. And like we sort of have a tension in our relationship. There's 16 years between him and Mom, 16 years between me and him. And I was always surprised at how generous he was and how willing he was. There were times where I would feel like Uncle John's tired. He's not going to want to do this. We're too early for him. And time again, while he may have been thinking those things privately to himself and even voiced them to me, he always opened up his heart and his home to the crew, even while his world was like very uncertain during that time we were shooting. He didn't know he'd have a place to live. He didn't know if we were just like, if people were going to make fun of him. He didn't know if this was something Nanny would be okay with. And I will say that like we did hear the Baptist church, they had an outdoor orchestra because it was the 4th of July, and they played the theme song from Designing Women, which is who like Suzanne Sugarbaker's character in Designing Women. That's who Uncle John's whole drag persona is based on. So he said to me in that moment, he knew that Nanny was on board with everything. So yeah, it's good.
That's nice. What else was I gonna check in on? Sorry, I'm going through my notes.
Go through your notes.
I guess I wanted to ask a little bit. I know it's awful to talk about, but I think you first premiered during the middle of the pandemic, right? So you've been able to find audiences, but was that a tricky way to try and get a film out, or what was the timeline around then?
Oh yeah, it remains a trick and a trade. And a treat. We premiered, like we were supposed to premiere right as COVID like was happening in New York City. Like I left editing with Max in Brooklyn, and I think within 3 weeks, New York was locked down, and they had canceled Tribeca. And so, no, it was not a fun time. And I took that cedar chest that, is mine now, and I put on an old Bette Midler record, followed by some old Aretha Franklin, and I drank some wine, and I cried my eyes out for whatever the life of this film would have been, to make way for what it is. And, I was very stubborn, and I didn't do any virtual screenings for the film because I really feel like it's a film that it is only benefited by sitting through it completely without the interruptions of being in your home. And that we wanted this to be amongst communities, to bring communities together. So for a long time, I resisted. And we sort of had always said as a joke, like, well, if we can't ever get this movie distributed, we'll just like create Uncle John's Traveling Salvation Show, and we'll like go around the country and like put it on the side of a truck or on like train trestles, whatever we have to do. And that actually became what happened. San Francisco Film Festival reached out in April of this year, 2020, and they were like, what's going on with Socks on Fire? And I was like, good question. We're thinking about doing this tour. And so Jesse Fairbanks there was really good to us and gave us a place to launch the tour out of at their drive-in. So we've negotiated in this way. We've been stubborn, we've waited, and now we've sort of launched this whole other thing that we would not have had otherwise, which is the Uncle John's Traveling Salvation Show, where we come out, I MC a drag show for 20 minutes before the screening. We screen the film, and then if you're very lucky, Uncle John resurrects Suzanne Twiggy Michaels at the end of the film for a final number. And so, there was a lot of pain and heartbreak over coming out during COVID, but I think that we're a film, and a crew has always just kind of rolled with it and worked with what was given and tried to be creative. Tried to bring next level creative thinking into the process. And so launching the tour it seemed like inevitable for us in a way. And it's like we've gotten to see the film in dairy farms in Savannah and like gravel parking lots in York, Alabama. So it's just opened up an idea about like how you actually get films to people that I really love.
Yeah, and you're still, because I just thought that the show we saw at Tribeca was just incredible. And that's like, you're still doing the tour, or what's it looking like for the next sort of?
Yeah, well, we just supposedly ended the tour in New Orleans at the New Orleans Film Festival, but there is talk about bringing it back next spring for some limited tour dates. We got to make sure everyone's available and that we can get people paid. But yeah, we're trying to bring it back because I think it is a really special thing.
Yeah, cool. And what's next? This is something so intimate and so personal. So where do you go from here? Like, what's next for you? Do you keep digging deeper or look elsewhere?
Yeah, both. I think all the options. I think there's a bookend to Socks on Fire about my dad's family in Arkansas. Like, it's really strange. Like, as soon as we were done with Socks on Fire, the sort of like other family issue, shady shit popped up in my dad's side of the family, but I don't know his side of the family so well. And it's about masculinity and about patriarchy and all the things I don't feel comfortable with as a Southerner. And so it will be interesting to think about it as a book into Socks on Fire, which is so much about matriarchy and femininity and where I feel at home. And then we're also working on a narrative script about a Southern gospel queen, a Gothic telling of her life that spans three time periods: the Alabama 40s, Kentucky in the 60s, and Central Florida in the late 80s, early 90s. Max is, huh? A triptych, right? It's called Vestal. And Max is directly implicated in all of these things because, we're storytelling brothers for life. Whether he likes it or not.
No, absolutely. I can't wait. I'm ready.
Cool. Well, thanks, guys. That was amazing. Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks for watching, everybody. And yeah.
Wasn't it incredible? Thank you, Kitty, for being such an amazing moderator.
Thank you. See ya.